again if you feel like you don't understand something today. Okay, I'm going to do 3 things today in this short presentation. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about what I call the 2 golden rules of teaching. Not just teaching language, but all teaching, math, art, science. I think there are 2 things that all good teachers do, and you, as a new language teacher, should remember to do these 2 things, okay? The second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about what I call the 3 principles of language teaching. And I sent your professor, and he sent to you a reading to do in English, and you might have also gotten a Farsi translation of that, so that you can understand a little bit about what are basic principles that we believe are correct in terms of guiding our language teaching. So I'm going to talk about those. Then I'm going to talk about mainly the main part of my talk. I'm going to talk about 5 different ways of teaching intermediate students, and I'll talk about what is an intermediate student before we talk about how you may want to teach them. Okay, so those are the 3 things I'm going to do: 2 rules of teaching, 3 principles of language teaching, 5 ways of teaching intermediates. Okay, let's start with the 2 rules of teaching. The first rule of teaching is to get your students to understand that they can learn what you're teaching. I call this club membership. You know how you join a club? You may join a music club or a soccer club or a hobby, something that you do, and you join and you're all members of the same group, right? That's the idea you want to give your students. You want to help them see themselves as members of the group. In this case, it's the group of people who can understand and who can speak English. That's what we call group membership. Okay? Now, you think about teaching, you're standing up in front of your students and your students are here listening to you. That's what we would call a face-to-face relationship. I'm talking to you. What we want you to think about is side to side. So you're next to your student and you're saying, we're members of the same group, you and me. We can do this together. So we call this club membership or group membership. How do you do that? Well, the first thing you want to do is you want to assume that they will be successful. You want to give them the idea that you are confident that they will learn what you are teaching. You know what, students? You are going to get this. Don't worry, I'm confident. You're bright, you will understand this. You want to be confident in their ability to learn. So that's the first thing you do. The second thing you do is you give them encouragement. You say, that's a good job, excellent. That encouragement, all good teachers know, helps students feel confident. And if they feel confident, they feel like they're a member of the group, that they can actually do this. Very important. The psychological, emotional part of learning is very important here. So you want to help encourage that by encouraging your students. The third thing is tell them when they do something right, more than when they do something wrong. As teachers, we often want to correct mistakes. No, that's wrong. You should do it this way. Instead, think about how you can help your students hear you say, you did that right. Very good, John. That's absolutely correct. So encouragement by telling them what they did right rather than telling them what they did wrong. That's another way you can help them feel like they're part of the group. And I think that all good teachers do this. All good teachers help students become members of their group. It's side-by-side kind of teaching. Okay, the second major or golden rule, as I call it, of teaching, of all teaching, is that you are relating what students know to what they don't know. You're trying to teach them something they do not know, right? They don't know English. They don't know the vocabulary. They don't know the grammar. They don't know the pronunciation, and so on. You want to, however, start with what they already know. You can't come in and just start teaching all these things they don't know, because the students won't understand it. In order to understand anything, you have to start with what you already know. So I already know that 1 + 1 = 2, okay? That's my knowledge of arithmetic. 1 + 1 = 2, 2 + 2 = 4. If I'm going to teach algebra or calculus or high-level math, I can't walk into my classroom and start just teaching x + y = etc., etc. I have to start with what my students already know. So all of learning is relating what you know to what you don't know. And as a teacher, your job is to relate what students know to what you are trying to teach them. Now, how do we do that? Most importantly, you have to understand who your students are. If you don't know what they know, there's no way for you to start relating what you're trying to teach them to what they know. So, for example, Professor Amir, when he asked me to give this talk, the first thing I asked him is, well, who are you? Who are your students? Are you beginners? Are you intermediates? Do you know about Steve Krashen and his ideas about language acquisition? What is your knowledge? And he told me who most of you on this call are, and that helped me figure out, okay, what should I tell you? How should I tell you what I'm going to tell you? I'm going to start with what I think you know, and then I'm going to relate that to what I want you to know. So knowing your students is the second step to being a good teacher. The second golden rule of good teaching is helping students relate to what they know already. And to do that, you have to know your students. It's like a business. If a business wants to sell you something, if I want to sell you a mug, I have to understand who you are. What are your needs? What is your background? What is your life like? The more you know those sorts of questions, the easier it is to sell something to you. Well, you as a teacher are selling ideas, information. So you want your students, you want to know your students so that you can understand how best to give that information to them. And how do you know your students? Well, you talk to them, right? You ask them questions, you find out what they like, what they don't like. And then you use that information in your lesson to try to relate what you're talking about to what they already know. Okay, so those are the two golden rules of teaching. Now let's move on and talk about what I think are three important principles of language teaching. So we're going from teaching now specifically to language teaching. Now I could talk all day, as most experienced professors, I could talk all day about how we learn languages, the theory and so forth. I don't want to do that. I want to keep things brief, which is why I gave you that reading that I hope all of you had a chance to read, to try to understand a couple of important concepts of how we teach languages, or at least how I think we should teach languages. The first principle of language teaching is to give students lots of what we call comprehensible input. And comprehensible input just means language you can understand, either by reading it or by listening to it. I like to think of this as an analogy of a bank. If you have a bank, you put money into your bank account. You can't take money out of your bank account until first you put money into your bank account. So before we can have students speak and write, we have to have students listening and reading. Input comes first. What kind of input? Input they can understand. Comprehensible language, comprehensible input. So that's the first good principle of language teaching, is you want to create a classroom, whether it's a beginning classroom, an intermediate classroom, or an advanced classroom. You want to create a classroom where you're giving students the chance to get lots of comprehensible input, meaning they're doing a lot of listening and a lot of reading. Now, that does not mean that they don't talk and write or react somehow. I'm not saying that you don't have any what we call output, speaking and writing, but the main focus is going to be on input, on listening and reading. Those are the two things that you want to focus on. And it has to be things that they can understand, and even better, things that they are interested in. Remember, I told you one of the golden rules of teaching is knowing your students, relating the unknown to the known. Once you understand what your students are interested in, you'll be able to talk about things and give them things to read that they will be interested in. And if they're interested in them, they're going to be more interested in continuing to get more comprehensible input. You, as a language teacher, only have your students a short amount of time every week or every day. If you're lucky, you get to see them every day. Many of you, I'm not sure how your school works, will perhaps not see your students more than once a week. That's not enough time for them to learn English. So you need to take that time and get them interested in something, so interested that when they go home, they want to continue getting more input. They'll want to continue to listen and to read it. That's why interesting, comprehensible input is so important. Okay, second major principle of language teaching. We want to, what we call, keep the affective filter low. Now, I don't talk about this in the reading, but I did include something in the diagram in the reading that I sent you that hints at this. And I'm going to try to share my screen now. I hope this works. Grant access to this. Oh dear. Let's see, desktop. Start sharing. Okay, I don't think that's working.
Well, Jeff, it's actually working. We have your screen now.
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Another rule of teaching, always understand the technology before you start teaching, okay? All right, so you're seeing now this diagram that I sent you. What you see here is you see that your brain has this thing, what we call the language acquisition device. That's the part of your brain that is processing language, that is learning, or we say acquiring the language. And on one side, you have the input, you have listening and reading. And on the other side, you have the output, you have writing and speaking. I've drawn a couple of red lines here. One of them says input filter, and one of them says output filter. What does that mean? I mentioned earlier that it's important that your students feel calm and relaxed, that they feel like they can be successful, that they're not anxious, that they're not nervous. When a student is relaxed and feels like they can be successful, they won't have anything preventing that listening and reading from getting into their brain. But when they feel nervous, when they feel like they're going to fail, when they feel anxious, there's a psychological block that happens, that even though students get reading and listening, for whatever reason, our brain doesn't accept it. Their language acquisition device doesn't work. That's why we want to keep that input filter low. A filter is something that prevents something else from going through or stops most of something from going through. We want to eliminate that filter, or we say lower that filter, so that all the reading and listening that they do, that actually reaches their language acquisition device. In the same way, we have what's called an output filter. We have things that prevent us from getting out into speaking and writing the language we have in our brain. Now, most of us can understand this. You know that if you're nervous or if you're anxious and then you have to speak English, you make a lot of mistakes, right? Or if you have to stand up in front of your class and give a presentation and you're feeling nervous, even in Farsi, you make mistakes. You can't say what you want to say, right? All of us who are speaking in another language have that experience. We call that the output filter. The reason we have an output filter is because we're nervous or we're anxious or we don't feel confident. We don't feel like we're a member of the group that speaks English well. So what we want to do instead is make students relaxed so that we lower that output filter. And just as that works for you, when you feel more relaxed and confident, your English gets better, right? That also works for your students. Okay, now I'm going to figure out how I unshare my screen. Let's see here. Okay, I'm gonna cancel the screen sharing, and hopefully it's just back to me now. All right. So, second major principle: keep students relaxed. Keep the affective filters low, the input and the output filter. Third major principle, and then we'll move on to our major topic here. The third major principle is don't worry about errors, especially for beginning and intermediate, lower intermediate students. If you start correcting your students' errors all the time, what's going to happen? They're going to feel anxious. They're going to feel nervous. They're going to feel like they're not a member of the group. I'm not saying that you should never correct mistakes, but if you can understand what your student is saying or writing, that's the most important thing. Think about how you feel when someone corrects your mistake. Now, I know there are some teachers out there who say, oh, I love it when you correct my mistakes. That means I can learn something. That's true for some teachers, but for most normal human beings, and we teachers are not always normal, for most people, when you correct their mistakes, that makes them feel more anxious and that makes them feel less confident. Error correction is not what you should focus on. You should focus on complimenting when your students get things right. Say, that's right, very good. That's the sort of feedback you want to give your students. So error correction should never be a focus of your teaching. Okay, so we now went through 3 principles of language teaching. How does this all relate to teaching intermediate students? That's our main topic for today. So I'm moving on now to the part 4 of your outline, which I sent you on how to teach intermediate language students. First question, before we can answer this, the main question of how you teach them, what is an intermediate student? What do I mean when I say an intermediate student? Well, an intermediate student usually is a student who can understand certain things without having a lot of additional help. A more technical way of saying this is that when you're a beginner, you usually need a lot of assistance in understanding the language. You may need pictures, you may need explanations, sometimes you may need translations, things that are going to help you understand the language. An intermediate is someone who can start to understand regular English with less help, or sometimes with no help. Now, in the technical sense, I define an intermediate as someone who knows the first, say, 2,000 most common words in English. So if we look at just the vocabulary level of an intermediate student, I would say somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 words. If you know the first most commonly used 2,000 words of English, or 2,000, maybe 3,000 words, you're probably not a beginner. Now you're an intermediate. Now there are things that you can actually understand without any help, things that are written for native speakers. They may be written for children, or they may be written for young teenagers, but you can start to understand that kind of English. That's an intermediate. How long does it take for you to study? How long does it take to get to be an intermediate? Well, that depends on how much comprehensible input you get. If you get lots of comprehensible input, that may be 500 to 1,000 hours. It might be 2,000 hours. It depends on if you're getting lots of good comprehensible input. If you're getting a beginning language class that's spending all of the time doing grammar and exercises, it may take you much longer because you probably aren't getting very much comprehensible input. So a beginner who has acquired or learned 2,000 to 3,000 words is probably an intermediate. Most of you, if you can understand most of what I'm saying today, are intermediates or above. And of course, many of you, your experienced teachers out there, are advanced. I understand that. But for those of you who are just starting out, many of you, most of you are probably intermediate, maybe a little above intermediate. Some of you, of course, have had a lot of English. Maybe you're advanced already, and that's wonderful. I would say advanced is probably 5,000 to 6,000 words of English. Now, don't worry too much about the technical definition, okay? But that's generally what we mean when we talk about an intermediate student. Now, I've listed 5 different ways that you can teach intermediate students. I'm going to talk about what I think is the most common way, or in some ways the best way, and then I'm going to go down the list to less common ones, but are still good, but may not be the most important for you in your classroom. The number one way that I put in terms of teaching intermediate students, the number one method, is what we call sheltered subject matter teaching. Oof. What does that all mean, right? Sheltered subject matter teaching. Well, teaching, you know, right? Subject matter is what we also call content. Subject matter is art, history, science, religion, math, crafts, cooking. Anything that you can teach is content, but not language. Language, you're not teaching language, you're teaching something else through language. Content teaching is teaching something other than language, which means you're not teaching vocabulary, you're not teaching grammar directly, you're teaching something else in English. And because you're doing it in English, people are learning the content, the knowledge, but at the same time, they're also learning English. It's a very powerful idea. You're teaching both language and content together, but the focus is on the content. The language is what you are using to teach the content. And because you are providing comprehensible input about art, about music, about history, about geography, about video games, about how to make clothing, about what's the best kind of coffee to drink, that is content. That's what students are learning, but at the same time, they're also learning English. That's what we call content area teaching. Now, why do we call it sheltered subject matter teaching? Sheltered means you're making it easy for them to understand the language. You're doing things, you're giving them graphics, you're giving them visuals, you're speaking more slowly. You're repeating important points. You're giving them an outline so they can follow along. You're reviewing at the beginning of every class what you talked about in the last class. All of these are techniques that we use to shelter or make it more comprehensible. Sheltered here just means making it more comprehensible. If you look up the word shelter in the dictionary, you'll see that it's anything that helps you get you out, for example, out of the cold or out of the rain. Your house is a shelter. A building could be a shelter. A tent, if it's raining out, you could run under the tent and the tent is sheltering you. It's protecting you from something. Well, in sheltered subject matter teaching, sheltered means making it easier for students to understand. Okay? All right. How do you teach sheltered subject matter teaching? Well, first of all, you have to teach something that you know about, right? Don't try to teach something that you've never studied yourself. If you don't know anything about history, probably not a good idea to try to teach your students history. So the first thing is, it has to be a topic that you know about. The second thing is, it has to be a topic that your students are interested in learning about. Now, sometimes they may not know anything about a topic, but you present it, you teach it in such a way that they get interested, that they get excited, like, wow, this is really interesting. Maybe you're going to teach them about the history of Iran, or the history of the Persians, or the history of the Romans, or the history of the Chinese. You do it in such a way that you're excited about it and they get excited about it. So you want to find a topic that is something you know about, and it's something that students are interested in. It has to be the intersection of those two circles, okay? What we call a Venn, V-E-N-N diagram, right? A Venn diagram, you probably know, is something like that, okay? Here's what you know, here's what students are interested in. You want to teach what's in between those two things. So the first thing is know your students, know what they're interested in, know what you think they could be interested in, and pick a topic that you can teach that they will be excited about and that you know something about. I'll give you an example. A good friend of mine who's an excellent teacher, his name is Warren Ediger. He has an excellent website, by the way, which I will put on my website. When I send you the link, I'll put his website on there so you can look at it. Warren Ediger is a brilliant online teacher, but he also has many years teaching in the classroom. And Warren used to teach his students art history. He would teach them about the history of European art for intermediate students in English. Now, when he taught them, of course, he had to explain certain things about the grammar he was using. He may have had to explain certain vocabulary, but he wasn't teaching grammar and vocabulary. He was teaching art. And at the end of the class, they would have questions, making sure they understood the main concepts about art, not about the language, about art. But In order to understand the concepts, they have to understand the language. So they're picking up the language subconsciously, unconsciously, while they're also learning about a topic. Now, how do you do this? Well, he did it with lots of course, he was teaching art, so he would show them pictures of art, and he would talk about the colors, and he would talk about the shapes. He would talk about what's going on here. He would give them a story. He would tell them the story, and the story became comprehensible input, okay? Storytelling is a very powerful way of teaching. Everyone loves to listen to a story, right? For example, yesterday, I went to the gym, you know, I'm working out. I was going to the gym and I was going to lift weights, and I was driving down the street to the gym, okay? And all of a sudden, a car comes out. What happened? Do you want to know what happened next? Of course you do. That's what a story does. It makes you interested. You want to find out what happens next, okay? Don't worry, it was fine. I didn't get into an accident. I just went around the guy and I went to my gym, okay? End of story. Storytelling, when you're teaching about any topic, is going to be more interesting to students. Imagine if your teacher starts every classroom with an interesting story about this topic. That's what you want to do. You want to think of topics. It doesn't matter what the topic is, really, as long as you know something about it and you can make it interesting to your students, or your students are already interested in knowing about it. When I study Spanish or French, I used to teach Spanish. And so I would talk about Mexico and the time I lived in Mexico. I lived in Mexico for 3 years and I learned to speak Spanish. And I would tell stories about my time in Mexico. And my students are interested because they're also learning Spanish. They also may want to go to Mexico or another Spanish-speaking country. Those kinds of stories, they could be stories about your life, they could be stories about your content area, but any kind of story is going to be interesting if you tell it right, okay? Now, telling the story also means making sure they can understand the story. So you may want to use graphics, you may want to use visuals, you may want to write something out on the board when you introduce a new word or a new term or a new concept. Anything you can do to make the English comprehensible. Okay, now, I've given you, it's very important in addition to teaching students in the classroom, especially for intermediate students who are able to read English, you want to give them things to read. I've given you a website called Simple English, which is a Wikipedia website, maybe you know it already, that has easy English readings on all sorts of topics. That's a good place to start in terms of preparing your lesson or in giving your students things to read. All right. How do you design a good lesson? Well, a good sheltered subject matter teaching lesson is like any other good lesson. All good lessons have 3 components, 3 elements, 3 parts. Introduction, beginning, middle, and end, okay? Introduction. In the introduction of a good class, the teacher tells you what you are going to learn, okay? The same is true, by the way, for a good piece of writing, a good article. If you're writing a paper for your professor, in the first paragraph, the first part, the first thing you should always do is tell your professor what you're going to tell them. So we say, tell them what you're going to tell them. You notice how I started this lecture. The first thing I did is I told you the 3 things we were going to talk about today. So now your mind is already thinking. You're thinking, okay, 1, 2, 3. You know where I'm going. It's like giving your students a map. Here's where we're going to go, okay? Forget about GPS. Okay? It's like the old maps, right? You're giving them a map to read so they know where you're going. So the first part of any good lesson, any good sheltered subject matter teaching, is to tell them what they're going to learn. And you want to do a couple of other things when you give that introduction. You want to get them interested in what you're going to do. So maybe you'll tell them a story. Maybe you'll ask them a question that by the end of the class, they will be able to answer. I like to do this with my students. I will start the class, I will put a question that I'm going to have them answer at the end of the class. So the entire class, they're thinking about how I can answer that question. Okay, it's something related, of course, to the main point of my class. All right. You may tell them a story to get them interested. It can be a picture. I'm going to talk about something related to this photograph today. Look at it, think about it. Talk to your neighbor for the next 60 seconds and tell them what you think I'm going to talk about today, or what you think the answer to my question is. Get them thinking about what it is you're going to do today. All good teachers do this when they start their classes. In addition to telling them what they're going to learn, they get their students thinking about what they're going to learn. They get them interested. And of course, the best way to do this, we're going back to our golden rules of teaching, is to know your students. To get them to feel like they're a member of the club, you have to start with the known. You have to know what your students know. Sometimes you can start your class just by asking your students questions. Who knows something about Pablo Picasso, the painter? Or who knows something about the United States Senate and House of Representatives? Or who knows something about the history of Africa? Whatever the question is, you're getting information and then you'll find out what they know, okay? The best way to find out what somebody knows is to ask them, right? Find out what they know, and then you can adjust your teaching. Oh, you don't know about that? Oh, okay, let me spend a few minutes talking about this, and then we'll talk about what I want you to know. All of that is important stuff that goes on at the very beginning of your class. So the first part of your class is tell them what you're going to tell them. The second part of the class is your presentation. This is what most of your class is, right? Most of your classroom is you are presenting something. Now, when I say presenting something, I don't mean that you have to talk all the time, okay? I don't mean that you're always providing the comprehensible input. It might be that you give students something to read. It might be that you give them something to listen to or something to watch. Or it might be that you give students something to read and you have them work together in small groups to try to figure out what it means. There are lots of different ways of presenting information, the new information that you are trying to get them to understand or to learn. And because this is a sheltered subject matter class, you are, of course, trying to get them to understand some sort of content. Typically, in a typical classroom, you have what's called you have a presentation of information. So you present information to students, then you help students do something with that information. Maybe it's they're drawing something, maybe they're answering questions, maybe they're looking at a series of statements and seeing if those are true or false, something that they're doing with the information. The third part of a good lesson is often what's called independent practice, where they're doing something on their own. That could be homework. That could be something they do towards the end of class, whatever it happens to be. Okay, so 3 parts of a good lesson. First, tell them what you want them to know. Tell them what you're going to tell them. Second, tell them, right? Third part, review. Tell them what you told them. At the end of every class, always take a couple of minutes to say, okay, what did we do today? What did we learn today? Here are the main points. Or maybe you'll have them get together and they tell you what they learned. That's the best way. But remember, language students, intermediate language students may not want to talk out loud in class, okay? So you have to be very careful that you have students. The best way is to volunteer. If you want to say something, raise your hand, okay?
Sorry, Professor, I accidentally muted you because I wanted to mute others. I'm so sorry for that. I think you can unmute yourself.
Okay, how about now?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's okay now.
Okay, okay. How long have I been muted?
Nothing. Just it was about the same time. Just
okay, okay. I don't have to start at the beginning.
No. Okay.
Okay, good.
All right. I'm sorry.
It's fine. Okay. So, third part of your lesson then is, of course, reviewing what you've already talked about. And that could be having them draw something. That could be having them answer questions. That could be have them talking to each other. Okay, or it could be you writing things on the board and saying, here are the main points that we've talked about today. So tell them what you're going to tell them. Tell them what you've told them. As I say, that's the basic structure for most good communication. If you're going to write a paper for a professor or you're going to write an article, you want to follow that exact formula. Okay. All right. That's the first of 5 ways of teaching intermediate students. I spent the most time on that because I think it's the one that is most useful for most teachers. Okay. Now, there are other ways that you can teach intermediate students in addition to, or sometimes instead of, a sheltered subject matter classroom. The second most important way, I think, is what we call a popular literature course. What do I mean by popular literature? Popular literature are books that people want to read. I'm not talking about Charles Dickens or William Shakespeare or Dante or Homer or any of the great English poets. I'm not talking about classic literature. Classic literature is great, don't get me wrong, and there are many students who want to read classic literature, but if you're an intermediate student, you will not be able to read Shakespeare. It's too difficult. You will not be able to read Charles Dickens in the original. It's too difficult. You want to pick something that's easier, that's comprehensible, and that's why I call this a popular literature course. When I'm talking about popular literature, I'm talking about usually fiction, not always, but usually fiction that's easy for students to read. Now, even intermediates or especially lower intermediates don't have a lot of things that they can read in English. So some companies have produced what are called graded readers. I'm not sure if you're familiar with these. I'm sure your professors, experienced professors are. Graded readers are, okay, sounds like some of you know what these are. These are things that are written especially for people who are learning English. So they make the vocabulary simpler, they make the grammar simpler, they make the story shorter, they tell you things but they repeat it, they make it easy for you to understand, they put an illustration, an image, a photo, something that helps you understand the main story, okay? Graded readers are excellent ways for intermediates to improve their language. They're a very good source of comprehensible input, especially for students who have 1,000 to 2,000 words of English. These are good sources, Oxford, Cambridge. There are a number of different companies that make graded readers. You can find them on the web. There are copies available. A popular literature course uses graded readers as the topic of the class. We're going to talk today, all of us are going to read the same graded reader. So in order for this to work, in order to have a popular literature course, all of the students have to have the book available to them, either on the web or on their tablet or a physical book. So you need multiple copies. One of the things you're trying to do with the graded readers, however, is introduce students to different things that they can read on their own in English. So it's an introduction to the world of popular literature in English. Once you finish reading graded readers, once you're about 3,000 or 4,000 words, then you can start reading easy books written for native speakers, books written for teenagers, books written for younger adults. Those books are written in easier English and are easier for you to understand. What you want to do in your popular literature course is you want to give them an introduction to things that they can go home and read on their own. Okay, now there are lots of graded readers, and maybe you'll spend the whole semester just using graded readers, or maybe you'll do partly sheltered subject matter teaching, and then the second part of class, maybe you'll talk about a graded reader, however you want to organize it. A popular literature class, however, is just like any other sheltered subject matter course. So really, although I'm talking about sheltered subject matter is one way, popular literature course is a second way, really popular literature courses is a subset. It's a type of sheltered subject matter course. You're teaching the book as the content. You're talking about the characters, you're talking about what happens. You're talking about the book itself, not primarily about the language. Of course, you'll have words they don't understand, or maybe there's be sentences they don't understand that you have to explain, but you're doing that only so that they can understand the story. So a popular literature course focuses on the story, not on the language. And as I say here, you teach this like a sheltered subject matter course. The goal of a popular literature course is to get their reading good enough so that they can start reading English on their own, whether it's on the internet or whether it's in a book. That's the goal, is to get them to do lots of reading. Okay. I'm going to move on now to the last three ways because I have less to say about them, but I want to talk about them each so that you at least have an idea about what I'm referring to, and then maybe we'll have time. We're running out of time here, but maybe for a few questions. There are three other ways that I think you can, things that you can do in an intermediate language course. The third thing is called sustained silent reading. Now this works best for teaching younger children, or when you have a class that you meet every single day. If you're just meeting your class one day a week, it's hard to do this because you don't have enough time to provide them with comprehensible input. This is best for, as I say, when you're teaching students every day, like in an elementary school or a high school, or if you're teaching them if you're teaching young children, this works a little better. Sustained silent reading is you give them a small amount of time in class to read anything they want. They get to pick the book. Now, of course, to do this, you have to have lots of books for them to pick. They have to be able to read things independently, and you have to have time in your class to do this. But if you have those things available, it's a wonderful way to get students interested in reading by giving them time in class to read. Now, for many language schools, this isn't possible. Students are going to have to do the reading on their own at home. But at least for some of you, if you're teaching in a grade school or a high school, it might be possible to give them time to read in class. You start small. You give them maybe 5 minutes to read, and then when they get used to 5 minutes, then you give them 7 minutes. When they get 7 minutes, you give them 10 minutes. You give them time to get used to reading by themselves in English. That's what's called sustained silent reading. Two other things that you can do in class, both of which relate to the things that we've already talked about, which are videos and podcasts. Videos, of course, are wonderful if you can get them with captions, okay? If they don't have captions and you're an intermediate student and you're trying to watch a movie or a television show, it's really, really difficult, okay? My Spanish is pretty good, okay? I speak Spanish pretty well, but if I try to watch a movie in Spanish, sometimes I have to turn the captions on. I have to have the words on because it's hard for me to get every single word. So if you're going to use videos, you have to use videos that have captions. Ideally, you can slow the video down a little so that students can figure out what's going on. I find it very useful if you're going to use a video to keep it short, to talk about what the video is, to watch it, and then to review it, and then maybe watch it again. The more you watch the video, the more you'll understand it, okay? But videos work really well in intermediate classrooms if they are part of a larger lesson, okay? You can't just walk in and say, okay, kids, today we're going to watch an hour of American movies. That's not going to work. It's not going to be comprehensible to them. So use videos, but use them cautiously, I would say. Finally, podcasts. Some of you may know I have a podcast myself that I and my colleague, Dr. Lucy Say, have been doing for 15 years. Podcasts are wonderful ways for students to listen to English outside of class, especially if they're podcasts where they're specifically helping students learn English. So I definitely would encourage students to listen to podcasts. They can slow the speed down. They can listen over and over again. And hopefully it'll be something that's of interest to them. They can listen to the podcasts that are interesting to them. And that will help them get more comprehensible input. BBC Learn English, Voice of America, both are good sources of both videos actually and podcasts that are designed for English learners. Okay, I've spoken a lot and I'm almost out of voice here. Professor Amir, maybe this is a good time. We have about 5 minutes left if some students or teachers have any questions.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. It was so informative, so rich. Actually, in an ELT world which is business driven, Jeff, I mean, with all those expensive books and material everywhere. I'm not talking about Iran, but I'm in Turkey at the moment, and I see that there are really expensive books coming from different companies. Yeah. Your talk is a comfort for language learners. And I'm sure that we will try to actually relay this comfort to our students, to people who are wishing to learn languages, that language learning doesn't have to be expensive. Mm-hmm. All right, so let's see if people have any questions, Jeff. Actually, you've been with us for like 2 hours now, because we were supposed to start at year 10, and it's year 12, actually. So you've been with us for 2 hours, so thank you so much for that. We promise that we don't ask you many questions, but let's see. Ghazale, okay. Do you have any questions? Puria, Ghazale, Mariam, anyone from the new teachers, guys? It's once in a lifetime opportunity, guys. Don't use it.
Can I ask a question?
Ghazale, go ahead, please.
Yes. Professor McQuillan, thank you so much for your very rich and comprehensive presentation. So my question concerns a new method that I've heard of. So what they try to do is that they provide the learners with some videos, and they ask the learners to actually watch the videos separate for several times. The first time just to get the gist of the topic, like what the whole video is talking about, what the whole concept is, and the second time they watch the video and they try to transcribe the sentences that they hear, and they should try to figure out the sentence stems. of the sentences. Like if a sentence has a sentence stem, they should write that down and they should work on those very sentence stems. And what they do next is that they try to talk to the teacher and they try to reproduce the story of the video using those sentence stems. So do you think this really works, like working on sentence stems?
Well, I'm not familiar with it, so I'm just going by your description, of course. I think it's a good idea to watch and rewatch videos. My problem is that I'm not sure if the transcription and the retelling. I think if you were a more advanced student, that might be something that might work. I myself, if we're going to try to improve my French, say, or my Spanish, I don't think I would do it. And the reason is I think it would be kind of boring to have to try to transcribe everything and re-listen. I don't think it's the best use of your time. Will it help? Maybe. I'm not saying it won't help. I don't know if it's the best, most efficient use of your time. I think it would be better simply to listen to something that you can understand 90% of or 95% of, or read something that you can understand 90 or 95% of. That would be a more efficient use than trying to watch something that you're only getting 50%. And then you're trying to go back and you're trying to get that 60%. I think it's if you have to do that sort of exercise, my guess is it's a little bit too hard for you and your students, and you should present them with easier comprehensible input rather than more intensive going back and listening over and over again type of input, if that makes any sense. So that's just my general reaction. Again, I'm not familiar exactly with the technique, but that's my reaction based on what you described.
Of course, thank you so much.
Sure.
So by sentence stems, they mean like the structures that are repetitively used by native speakers. Like these sentences are like cliffhangers, like I like to, my name is, or structures that are being used all the time. And what they do is they try to figure out these actually sentence stems, and they try to reuse, like it's like they memorize the sentence stems and they try to use them in their speech. So
I see what you're saying now. Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt. Yeah, I don't think one of the things that we didn't talk about today was the difference between acquisition and learning, between conscious learning and subconscious learning. The most important thing that we want to give students is things that they're going to acquire subconsciously or unconsciously. So all the most common stems that we use in English, you're going to hear them over and over and over and read them over and over again. And when you do that, your language acquisition device is going to pick those up without you having to study them. So I would say that, again, for efficiency purposes, you want to worry more about making sure that the input is understandable and comprehensible rather than them focusing on trying to consciously memorize things. I don't think that's the most efficient approach. But we don't have a lot of time for me to
Thank you. Thank you. I got my answer. Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you so very much.
Puriya, do you have any questions, or do you know of anyone who has questions? Because we have to be a little bit quick. You're running out of time already.
No. I used it. It was really helpful.
Thank you, Professor. I'll feel free. I'll send you an email that you can send your students, and if they have questions later, feel free to email me. I'm happy to do that.
Definitely.
Okay.
Jeff, just a few seconds, if we can turn on the cameras and take a group snapshot, a photo of anyone who wants to turn on their camera so that we can take a group photo. And in the meantime, Jeff, I should tell you, I was supposed to actually, as the chair of the session, I was supposed to read your bio because I had already shared it with all the participants. I thought that maybe for the interest of our time, I didn't have to read your bio. And also, again, I'm promising that all your lessons will be kept in our hearts and in our minds, and we will use your lessons in our classes for sure, as you're going to be part of our educational memory forever and ever. So everyone, you can turn on your cameras and we can take a photo, group photo, before we call it a night and call it a day for Jeff, call it a night for us. Okay, wonderful. Okay. So lots of thanks to all the teachers who were with us tonight, the experienced teachers, Tony, Sherzi, Ghazale, Anastasia, Ms. Kargar, and everyone who was there, Faiza Khatami, Mariam, everyone, and all the new teachers. I wish you good luck with such a start. I'm addressing young teachers now. With such a start, a lot is expected from you, you know. So you had Jeff talk to you at the start of your career, so you should end up being wonderful and professional trainers in your careers. So thank you so much again, Jeff. Hopefully, yeah, hopefully we will see you some other time in the future with another lesson.
Okay. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye for now.
Bye. Bye. Bye, Jeff.